مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. قبل 70 عاما تقريبا ألقى سناتور جمهوري من ولاية ميشيغان واحدة من أهم الخطب التي لا تنسى حول السياسة الخارجية الأميركية. ربما يتناهر حزبان السياسيان بالدراوة في الداخل حول قضايا كثيرة على حد قوله، ولكن معاركنا السياسية يجب أن تنتهي عند حافة الماء، وبذلك قصد أن السياسة الخارجية ينبغي ألا تنحاز لأحد الحزبين دون الآخر، وإنما يجب أن تعكس القيم والمصالح المشتركة بيننا نحن الأمريكيين. في العقود الأخيرة ضعفت فكرة السياسة الخارجية التي يجمع عليها الحزبان، فكثيرا ما يتناهر الديمقراطيون والجمهوريون بنفس الشدة والدراوة حول قضايا دولية مثل اتفاق إيران النووي والاتفاقيات التجارية والاتفاقية التغير المناخي، كما يفعلون حول قضايا محلية مثل الضرائب والرعاية الصحية. في برنامج داخل واشنطن هذا الأسبوع وفي الأسابيع المقبلة سنسأل: هل توجد سياسة خارجية ديمقراطية؟ هل توجد سياسة خارجية جمهورية؟ ما أوجه الاختلاف بينهما؟ وما العوامل المشتركة بينهما؟ هذا الأسبوع ضيفنا واحد من أهم مسؤولي السياسة الخارجية في الإدارتين الديمقراطيتين السابقتين، وهو مستشار مهم لقضايا الشرق الأوسط لكل من الرئيس أوباما والرئيس كلينتون. ضيفنا روبرت مالي. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. Our guest today is one of the key fixtures of Democratic administrations focusing on American foreign policy in the Middle East. Our guest is Robert Malley. Rob, thank you for joining us on Dakhel Washington. Rob, is there, in your view, a democratic foreign policy?
Not really. I mean, I think democratic foreign policy, there's a wide range, and we saw it in the last presidential election. You know, there wasn't necessarily a huge gulf between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, but there were big differences, and in some instances, Republicans were closer to one or to the other. So I don't think that there's a democratic foreign policy, nor do I think there should be one. I think there needs to be diversity discussion to try to get to the best answer. But what there is, and we might get to it, is there's a partisanship that develops so that there's something that's identified as more of a democratic instinct and more of a Republican instinct. But I think there's a lot of heterogeneity within the Democratic Party, and as I say, I think that's a good thing. I think that we suffer more from groupthink, from people trying to always echo what their colleagues say, and I think we'd be better served, the Democratic Party, like the Republican Party, by having as animated and rich a discussion, even if a debate, as possible.
So what would you say are the most serious debates within the broader Democratic tent on foreign policy writ large, and we'll get to the Middle East more specifically?
I mean, the debates, again, I'm just looking at the last presidential election. There's a big debate about trade, which is a foreign policy issue in its own right, which is, you know, are U.S. interests served by entering into broad trade agreements? There's a big debate about the purposes and values of military intervention, particularly in the Middle East, but not just in the Middle East, about humanitarian intervention and what the role of the United States should be in the world. About the way to be given to some traditional alliances, I think you're seeing more of a debate within the Democratic Party, certainly than you'd seen in the past, and I think, again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So I think there's basically, I would put into two categories: a debate about what should be the U.S. role in the world policeman, party that should go in and to intervene to save lives or to protect economic or other interests. So that's one basket, and the other basket is the whole debate about globalization. Is that good for the United States? Is it good for the American worker? Is it good for the American working class? Or is it only good for a globalized elite. I think those are the two axes, role in the world and intervention, globalization versus sort of more looking inside, around which the debates currently are taking place.
So you had the ear of two American presidents. How would you characterize your own position on this spectrum?
It's a good question. I think I vary. I mean, I'm not. You can't. I don't think I could be sort of put in one box. In some cases, well, my personality, I tend to second guess everything I think. So by definition, I won't fall in one category. I tend to be both in favor of trade, but I think we have to be extremely careful that trade agreements, which is not my expertise, but that they be constructed in a way that defends the environment and labor rights, et cetera. So we can't give away too much. I've been more invested in the question of America's place in the role, and role in the world, and I've grown skeptical. I think that's well known by people who know me, of the ability, the wisdom, the efficiency of American military intervention in the Middle East in particular, which is where I've spent most of my studying and policy time. I just think the examples, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, et cetera, have put me more on the humble side of that spectrum about how much good the U.S. can do, not just to itself, but also to the people on whose behalf it's intervening. So I'd be more on the skeptical side, but doesn't mean I rule out the use of force or that I rule out intervention. But I think we have to ask much harder questions before jumping to the military option.
One among the terms you haven't mentioned are democracy and human rights. How valuable do you think, or how important do you think, what priority do you put on these issues as being centerpieces of American foreign policy?
So I would put that in the basket of America's role in the world, but you're right that it's slightly different from humanitarian intervention or military intervention. It's more in terms of how much we push for our values. Again, I'm going to give you an answer that won't fall straight into one box. I think it's important for the U.S. to continue to stand for its values. I think it's important for us to have that be a factor in our relationship with other countries. Doesn't mean that we break relations with countries that don't espouse our values or that don't respect human rights, but the U.S. often provides assistance that could be calibrated to whether we think a particular country is abiding by certain values, and then the values are also because we think it's in our interest. We think that following certain values, respecting human rights, the rule of law, are good for stability, are good for making sure that extremist groups don't arise. So it's not just a values view, it's a values that very quickly bleeds into interests. I don't think that it's the U.S. role to go impose certain political systems or certain normative values on other countries. We make our own decisions, but in terms of the quality of the relationship we have with other countries, that should be a factor. So we don't necessarily have to invade a country to impose a system, as we may have tried to do in Iraq, which was, I think, an unmitigated disaster. But what we can do is say, in certain cases, you want assistance. Well, that assistance is tied to certain values because we think it's the right thing to do and because we think it's good for us and good for you. So I think it needs to be a factor. I think I think some administrations may have gone too far in that direction. Others maybe not far enough. I think it's a factor for, as I say, both normative reasons, but also for interest reasons.
All right, so let's look, let's take this sort of high-level, 30,000-foot discussion, and let's apply it to at least some of your personal experience. What are some of the most real-life debates that you were party to, or that you witnessed, that take these issues that we're debating? How much realism versus idealism, how much democracy versus cold realpolitik in, say, the Obama administration? What was the most
spoiled for choice, maybe. Fortunately or unfortunately, almost every issue we dealt with came down to some of these questions. What do we do in Syria? Do we intervene? Do we not intervene? Do we support the opposition? In what ways or not? Do we intervene directly or not? We had obviously the same question in Libya. And on the question of tying our policy towards certain countries with certain values, Egypt and Bahrain clearly come to mind most evidently. I mean, when we deal with adversaries like Iran, it's a different calculation. But when it comes to countries with which we have close relationships, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Bahrain, how much do we take into account their domestic policies? And there was always a debate, and you could imagine, given the composition of the Obama administration, who would line up on what side and who was more inclined to say, we have hard, cold interests, we can't afford to sacrifice them, even if we're not particularly happy with what so-and-so government is doing in terms of human rights or detaining people without due process of law or torture or whatever. There was the camp that said, we have to stick to our main interests, security interests, and others who said, both for reasons of values, but also long-term interests. You know, I'll take a case of Egypt. Some people would argue that the mass detention of people for political reasons, I think that was clearly our diagnosis, was not just inconsistent with our values, but could well be the reason or the trigger for the next generation of extremists with which both Egypt and the United States and the rest of the region would have to contend.
In, say, the experience of the Obama administration, was there a consistent approach, or was it a case-by-case, and you would sometimes do one, sometimes do the other?
I think...
I mean, if an objective person were to look at this, would they say it was consistent, or was it...
Well... So I mean, every debate is case by case.
Right.
I think there's a pattern that emerged, right? And the pattern was that there was some withholding of assistance. That was true of Bahrain. That was true of Egypt, but not enough to really create a rift in the relationship. Enough to create an irritant. That's for sure. Didn't really work in changing the policy. So I think, for me, this is an open question. I think there was a pattern that developed. I'm not defending it as the best pattern. I'm not sure what a better alternative is. I've yet to be convinced either by a view which would say conditionality never works, and therefore we should give it up and just follow our interests, our hard, cold, hard interests, because I just don't think that's how we should operate. On the other hand, I think it is a fact that conditionality has had, at best, mixed success, at least in the short term. You know, some of my colleagues who are much more in the human rights world would say these can't be measured in a one presidential term. You need consistency along presidential administrations. That brings us to the other issue, and unfortunately there had not been that much consistency, and that's maybe both a Republican and Democratic problem, but there has not been that much consistency. So if you have 4 years of conditionality and then you erase it, then you obviously have not accomplished anything. But if you could have a consistent policy of saying there's certain forms of assistance you'll get if you meet certain benchmarks and others you won't get, maybe over time that would succeed. But the answer to your question is I think there's a pattern that developed not because there was an overarching theory, but because case by case that's where the balance of discussion in the administration ended up in almost every case. Okay, very good. When we come back after the break, we'll talk with Rob about some of the great achievements and perhaps some of the great regrets of engaging in the Middle East over 2 administrations in just a moment. Our guest today, again, is Rob Malley. Rob is an intellectual who has been a long-serving foreign policy practitioner, or perhaps the opposite, a high-level government official who is down deep a serious thinker. He is currently Vice President for Policy of the International Crisis Group, responsible for shaping this major problem-solving NGO's work around the world. He comes to this job after service in the Obama administration as Special Assistant to the President, Senior Advisor to the President for the Counter-ISIL, that's the Islamic State campaign, and White House Coordinator for the Middle East, North Africa, and the Gulf region. That's a mouthful. And in the previous Democratic administration, Rob served as Special Assistant to President Clinton for Arab-Israeli Affairs and Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs at the National Security Council. That's also a lot of government. Rob's academic background is not too shabby either. Yale University, Harvard Law School, Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. So, Rob, let me ask you about episodes from both administrations, not even ones that you've necessarily dealt with. President Clinton famously recalled that Rwanda was one of his biggest mistakes, not dealing with the Rwandan genocide. President Obama had a different approach to the mass atrocities in Syria, not getting directly engaged, but not viewing it, I think it's fair to say, as something America could engage with successfully. Do you see a connection here or different lessons to be drawn from these 2 experiences? So as I said, I was not involved in Rwanda, so I don't know I can't really compare it. Obviously, a lot of people who live through Rwanda or live through the Balkans argue that we should take, including within the Obama administration, argued for a much more robust policy. I mean, for me, one of the tragedies of the many tragedies of Syria, and the one I'm going to mention now is probably a minor one, but one of the problems of the Syria experiment is I think everyone came out of it more convinced that they were right in terms of their policies coming in than not. In other words, I think it ended up vindicating both sides of the argument. So those people who argued that we should intervene because if we didn't intervene, things would go from bad to worse, and we saw, over 500,000 dead and an extraordinary refugee exodus, the destruction of a country. So they would argue we should have intervened. And I think those who argued that in 2011, 2012 would say we were right, look at what happened. And those who argued we should stay away because this is we won't be able to control the direction of events. More radical extremist groups are going to take over in any event, regardless of what we do. Other countries that are going to have escalation, dominance, countries like Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, because they could work with a sitting government, so they're going to be able to match and exceed what we do. So it's going to be an open-ended conflict. Those people who may have held that in 2011, 12, 13 would say, you see, we were right. Look at the trajectory of Syria. Look at what's happened. So I think it's unfortunately a case where I'm not sure that those who were directly involved learned that many lessons, because I think the baggage they came in with is very much the baggage with which they left, and again, feeling quite confirmed in their earlier views. I think it's going to take some time. I think it's going to take more sort of third-party analysis of what happened to try to really see, were there options to do something different, what impact it would have had. But in the short term, I think the lessons are probably lost on most people.
How important is it to achieve bipartisanship in foreign policy? You were involved in all sorts of initiatives, multiple administrations, some of which had bipartisan support and some of which didn't. How important is it?
It's obviously better, but I suspect if I were president, which I will never be, but if for presidents in place, if they feel very strongly about something, and that's been the case, I think, of administrations for generations, if they feel very strongly about something, they will do it in the absence of bipartisan support. But bipartisan support is better, not just because it means that you're reflecting something that is, you reflect views of the entire country, or as much of it as you can capture, but it also means that it's more likely to be sustained over time. And the worst thing, it's true of domestic policy, it's true of foreign policy, is to have a zigzag approach where one day one administration does X and then the next administration does non-X. It's not good for us, it's not good for our foreign policy, it's not good for the countries on the receiving end, because they won't know then, how long a certain policy is going to last. So it's an ideal, it's rarely fully achieved, and it's less achieved now than it was in the past just because of the polarization of the American political system.
So this leads me to ask you about the Iran nuclear deal. A great achievement for the Obama administration, achieved without a majority support in the United States Senate. Actually, quite a large majority voted against, but not enough to prevent it. In retrospect, was there anything that you think could have been done to have made this an agreement that earned the support of a majority, or was the die cast in reaching a deal with Iran that it just wasn't ever going to have the support?
So as I said earlier, I second guess almost everything I do, or policies that we've been engaged in, whether it's Syria, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I haven't second guessed this one yet. I don't think I will on the question that you're asking. I don't think we could have reached an agreement with Iran, which I think was a very important thing to do, and we could discuss why, with majority support in the Senate or with Republican support, period. Both because of the polarization of the political system. I'm not sure that almost anything President Obama would have done would have encountered support from his from the Republican side, but particularly on this issue, which is an extremely toxic issue, as you know as well as anyone, and the issue of Iran and how all the passion and emotion that goes into it. I think once the president had decided that dealing with the nuclear issue was a priority, which frankly I would say reflected the priority of our allies of some of our allies as well, even though they may have then had a slightly different take. I think once he decided that, he knew that he couldn't count on the support of Republicans in Congress. Even some Democrats, as you say, were opposed as well. But I think it was the right thing to do, and I think it was the right thing to do even without that support. But as we know today, that makes it a much more fragile deal than would have been the case otherwise. But I think otherwise we wouldn't have had a deal.
In retrospect, are there any aspects of this deal or any aspects of the criticism of the deal that you think are legitimate and that, well, geez, maybe we could have done or should have tried to address a little bit better?
You know, any deal is perfectible, right? I mean, I've often reflected, if you leave a negotiation, you have to ask yourself, why didn't I get more? Because if the other side accepted this, then they probably would have accepted a little bit more. I suspect the Iranians think the same thing. So could it have been better? No doubt. I mean, but I was involved in the negotiations. It was what I spent a year and a half of my life doing day in, day out. I'll make a confession. Was it perfect? No. Okay, so it's said. But do I, and the legitimate but I think even if we had addressed some of those flaws, I wouldn't call them flaws, if we had tried to do better, I still think it wouldn't have met the bar of our critics. On the nuclear side, I think the deal actually did what it needed to do, and that was, you know, President Obama said, I want to get the assessment of nuclear experts who are not going to be sort of have a stake in the deal, but I want them to assess this and to assess it as much as rigorously as they can. And the answer he got was, in terms of the goals, the objective that he had set forward on the nuclear side, it worked. I think the legitimate, or the criticism that I understand, don't relate to the deal. They relate to what's outside the deal and what's after the deal, right? Those are two issues. Outside the deal, you know, ballistic missile activity by Iran, its activities in the region, its support for terrorist groups, its human rights record. Yes, it doesn't address that. I don't think we would have had a deal. I think we would be debating now, you know, how to get a deal with Iran today and next year and the year after that, if what we tried to do was get a comprehensive deal that dealt with Iran's foreign policy, essentially, and the nature of the regime to some extent. Again, I think dealing with the nuclear issue was critical precisely because Iran is a country that we can't fully trust at all on those activities. So yes, we needed to reach a nuclear deal, and I think if we could have addressed the non-nuclear aspects, great, but I don't think we could have, and so I think it would have been a mistake. Now the other question is what comes after, and that's, you know, we could spend hours debating after what, because some of the constraints last for a very long time, some last forever. But it is true that some very serious critics have said, well, what's going to happen in 2030, 2020, 25, 30? I mean, what happens when some of these constraints expire? That's a question where I think, you know, if you look back, both sides, Iran and the US probably thinks, oh, I could have gotten a bit better. You know, we got 15 years, 20 years, 25 years on some issues. Maybe we could have got 30, 35, 40. Would that have satisfied our critics? I mean, many of our critics would have said the same thing. They would have said in 30 years, Iran could develop its fully fledged nuclear program. So how is that? So I don't think it was conceivable to get an open-ended deal where Iran accepted never to have these constraints lifted, some of those constraints lifted. So I think, again, we would have been negotiating till we're blue in our face. I think our allies and we reached the conclusion, this is the best we can do given the circumstances, and it was good enough. So, but I would say when I debated, I think we met with you when we were negotiating, and I think you came over to the White House. When I heard the two things I heard that I thought we needed to take most seriously was the outside and after. The deal itself, I think it met or exceeded the expectations of most of the analysts who we were working with outside of government about what we could achieve.
Rob Malley, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Washington. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول أوجه الاختلاف في السياسة الخارجية بين الحزبين الديمقراطي والجمهوري، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elhura.com. معكم روبرت شكرا لكم وإلى